Chapter 7 of The Ordeal of Mark Twain by Van Wyck Brooks. This recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 7 The Playboy in Letters. How can great minds be produced in a country where the test of a great mind is agreeing in the opinions of small minds? John Stuart Mill. We have now watched the gradual building up and the final flowering in Mark Twain of the personality which his mother, his wife, all America indeed, had, so to speak, wished upon him. It came into existence, we recall, that personality, through his mother's ruthless opposition to the poet in him, through the shock of his father's death, and every influence he had encountered in life had confirmed him in the pursuit of opulent respectability. We have seen, however, that this was not the real Mark Twain, this money-making, success-loving, wire-pulling Philistine. It was a sort of dissociated self, the race character, which had risen in him with the stoppage of his true individuality. The real Mark Twain had been arrested in his development. The artist had remained rudimentary. And this is the Mark Twain we have to consider now. "What a child he was," says Mr. Paine, "always, to the very end." It was this childishness which caused and which explains his lack of spiritual independence as a man, and which accounts for the character of his work as a writer. What a child he was! Glance in the first place at that famous temperament of his. Perhaps the best impression we have of it is one written by his friend Joseph Twichell in a letter from Switzerland, where they were tramping together in 1878. Mark Twain was 43 at the time. "Mark is a queer fellow," says Twichell. "There is nothing that he so delights in as a swift, strong stream. You can hardly get him to leave one when once he is within the influence of its fascinations. To throw in stones and sticks seems to afford him rapture. Tonight, as we were on our way back to the hotel, seeing a lot of driftwood by the torrent side below the path, I climbed down and threw it in. When I got back to the path Mark was running downstream after it as hard as he could go, throwing up his hands and shouting in the wildest ecstasy, and when a piece went over a fall and emerged to view in the foam below, he would jump up and down and yell. He said afterward that he hadn't been so excited in 3 months. He acted just like a boy." And observe what he said of himself in The Turning Point of My Life. "By temperament I was the kind of person that does things, does them and reflects afterward. So I started for the Amazon without reflecting, and without asking any questions. That was more than 50 years ago. In all that time my temperament has not changed by even a shade. I have been punished many and many a time, and bitterly, for doing things and reflecting afterward, but these tortures have been of no value to me. I still do the thing commanded by circumstance and temperament, and reflect afterward." One could hardly ask for a more perfect definition of immaturity. Then there was his boyish passion for make believe, his inclination for gorgeous trappings and medieval splendor, what Mr. Paine calls the fullness of his love for theatrical effect. We know how he enjoyed dressing up for the children's charades, how he reveled in the costumes of The Prince and the Pauper. His lifelong delight in showing off had the same origin. Mr. Paine tells how in Washington once, when they were staying at the Willard Hotel, supposing that Clemens would like to go down to dinner with as little ostentation as possible, he took him by an elevator that entered the dining room directly, and without stopping at the long corridor known as Peacock Alley. When they reached the dining room, however, Clemens inquired, "Isn't there another entrance to this place?" And hearing that there was, a very conspicuous one, he added, "Let's go back and try it over." "So," says Mr. Paine, "we went back up the elevator, walked to the other end of the hotel, and came down to the F Street entrance. There is a fine stately flight of steps, a really royal stair, leading from this entrance down into Peacock Alley. To slowly descend that flight is an impressive thing to do. It is like descending the steps of a throne room, or to some royal landing place where Cleopatra's barge might lie. I confess that I was somewhat nervous at the awfulness of the occasion, but I reflected that I was powerfully protected. So, side by side, both in full dress, white ties, white silk waistcoats, and all, we came down that regal flight. Of course, he was seized upon at once by a lot of feminine admirers, and the passage along the corridor was a perpetual gauntlet. I realize now that this gave the dramatic finish to his day, and furnished him with proper appetite for his dinner. All the actors in the world may protest that they would do the same thing. The motive is none the less for that an adolescent one. When Mark Twain marveled at the court costumes of the Indian princes at Oxford, when he said he had been particularly anxious to see the Oxford pageant in order to get ideas for his funeral procession, which he was planning on a large scale, when he remarked, "If I had been an ancient Briton, I would not have contented myself with blue paint, but I would have bankrupted the rainbow." Was he not at 60, at 70, just, or rather still, Tom Sawyer? Then there was his sense of proportion, or rather his lack of any sense of proportion, his rudimentary judgment. I shall say nothing here of his truly dazzling display of this in matters of business. But did not Mark Twain, who was supposed to understand his own countrymen, foretell that within a generation after his death America would be a monarchy, a literal monarchy, not merely a citadel of economic reaction? Did he not affirm with all conviction that the Christian Scientists would so increase and multiply that in 40 years they would dominate our political life? There are certainly at this time Western cities where that has occurred, but Mark Twain, the hardy prophet, seems never to have glimpsed the nascent forces into whose control the political and economic future seems really bound to pass. In all the years of his traveling to and fro through Europe he divined hardly one of the social tendencies that had so spectacular a denouement within 4 years of his death. In Austria, where he spent so much time at the turning of the century, he was dazzled by the pomp of the assassinated Empress's funeral. "This murder," he writes with the fatuity of a schoolboy, "will still be talked of and described and painted 1,000 years from now." But what did he make of that memorable clash he witnessed in the Reichsrath between the Czech and the German deputies? All history was involved in that, as any one can see now, as a discerning man might almost have seen then. In Mark Twain's stirring times in Austria it is scarcely anything but a meaningless brawl. He does not make comic copy of it. He reports it with all gravity, but he understands nothing of it. Indeed, he freely says so. It was this same childish incuriosity regarding the nature and causes of the human drama, this same rudimentary cultural sense, that led him always instinctively to think of history, for instance, just as boys of 10 used to think of it, as a succession of kings, that led him into that reckless use of superlatives wherever his interest happened to be engaged. He assured Mr. Paine that the news of somebody's discovery of the Baconian authorship of Shakespeare's plays would reach him by cable wherever he was, that "the world would quake with it." And he said, without any qualification whatever, that the premature end of the Russian Japanese war was "entitled to rank as the most conspicuous disaster in political history." And quite on a par with his reckless juvenility of judgment was Mark Twain's level of reflection. The jottings from his notebooks that Mr. Paine has published consist mainly of mere childlike observations of sheer fact or expressions of personal animus. His remarks on social, political, and economic subjects are precisely of the sort one would expect from what is called the average man. "Communism is idiocy," for example. "They want to divide up the property. Suppose they did it. It requires brains to keep money as well as to make it. In a precious little while the money would be back in the former owner's hands, and the communist would be poor again. The division would have to be remade every 3 years, or it would do the communist no good." Is that the sort of exploded platitude one looks for from a famous man of letters? Imagine a French or an English writer of rank, even of the most conservative color, committing to paper an opinion so utterly unphilosophical. One would say that Mark Twain had never thought at all. And then, most significant of all, there was his undeveloped aesthetic sense. "Mark Twain," says his biographer, "was never artistic, in the common acceptance of that term. Neither his art nor his tastes were of an artistic kind." But such distinctions lose their meaning an inch below the surface. Every one is artistic. Mark Twain, like the majority of people, was merely rudimentarily so. His humorous acknowledgments of this fact is, of course, well known. All the world remembers how he said that in Beirut he felt like a heretic in heaven. "Well," he adds, in The Shrine of St. Wagner, "I ought to have recognized the sign, the old sure sign that has never failed me in matters of art. Whenever I enjoy anything in art it means that it is mighty poor. The private knowledge of this fact has saved me from going to pieces with enthusiasm in front of many and many a chromo." What did he like? In painting, Landseer. "And the way he makes animals absolute flesh and blood, insomuch that if the room were darkened ever so little, and a motionless living animal placed beside a painted one, no man could tell which was which." In music, the Jubilee Singers. "Away back in the beginning, to my mind, their music made all other vocal music cheap, and that early notion is emphasized now. It moves me infinitely more than any other music can. I think that in the Jubilees and their songs America has produced the perfectest flower of the ages." In poetry, Kipling. "I guess he's just about my level." In earlier years, we are told, an ancient favorite called "The Burial of Moses" became for him a sort of literary touchstone, and this general order of taste remained his to the end. There was a moment when he read Browning, a rage that Mr. Paine finds unaccountable, though we can perhaps attribute it to the fun he had in puzzling it all out. He had a lifelong passion for Omar Khayyam, but that was half a matter of rhythm and half a matter of doctrine. He had a sanguinary encounter with Flaubert Salammbô, which he didn't like "any of it." Otherwise his chosen reading was wholly non-aesthetic. He detested novels in particular. "I never could stand Meredith and most of the other celebrities," he said inclusively. He called Warfield's The Music Master as permanent as Jefferson's Rip Van Winkle, as for that matter it was. Indeed, he seems to have taken a general passive pleasure in all the popular plays and stories of all the seasons. The positive note in his taste, then, was the delight in sonorous sound, with haunting suggestions of mossy marble and Thanatopsianism, in short, that sense of swinging rhythm which is the most primitive form of aesthetic emotion, combined with just those tints of sentiment, by turns mortuary and supermasculine, which are characteristic of an Anglo Saxon adolescence. Now, all these traits of an arrested development correspond with the mental processes we find at work in Mark Twain's literary life. In his lack of pride, of sustained interest in his work, of artistic self determination and self control, in his laziness and loose extravagance, one finds all the signs of the impatient novice who becomes gradually the unwilling novice without ever growing up to the art of letters at all. Finally, as we shall see, the books he wrote with love, the books in which he really expressed himself and achieved a measure of greatness, were books of, and chiefly for, children, books in which his own juvenility freely registered itself. "Papa has done a great deal in his life that is good and very remarkable," wrote little Susy Clemens when she was 14 years old. "But I think if he had had the advantages with which he could have developed the gifts which he has made no use of in writing his books, he could have done more than he has, and a great deal more, even." I should like to point out that there is more discernment in the fragmentary notes of this little girl than in anything else that has been published about Mark Twain. Susy Clemens was a born psychologist. She was always troubled about her father. She seems indeed to have been the only one of his family, his associates, to conjecture in her dim, childish way that his spirit was at odds with itself, that a worm perhaps, for she could never have said what or why, lay at the root of that abounding temperament. When she set down this note her father was in the full glory of his mid career. Wealth and fame were rolling in upon him and tides of praise from all the world. He was on a pinnacle of happiness, indulging to the full that reckless prodigality, spiritual and material, in which he found his chief delight. Mr. Howells, Twichell, those who watched over him, fell, like so many children themselves, into that mood of spendthrift adolescence. Was his house always full of carpenters and decorators, adapting it to some wider scheme of splendid living? Was there no limit to that lavish hospitality? Was his life constantly broken by business activities, by trips to Canada, by the 101 demands that are laid upon an energetic man of affairs? Not one of his friends seems ever to have guessed that he was missing his destiny. Some years ago Mr. Howells reprinted the long series of his reviews of Mark Twain's books. Admirable comments as they often are from a literary point of view, there is not the slightest indication in them of any sense of the story of a human soul. His little daughter alone seems to have divined that story, and she was troubled. Something told her what these full-grown men of letters and religion never guessed, that this extravagant playboy was squandering not his possessions, but himself, scattering to the winds the resources nature had committed to him. And she alone knew, perhaps, that somehow, sometime, he would have to pay for it. Indeed, for it is not yet the time to deal with consequences, was there ever anything like the loose prodigality of Mark Twain's mind? "His mental Niagara," says Mr. Paine, "was always pouring away." It was, and without any sort of discrimination, any sort of control. He tossed off as the small change of anecdote thousands of stories, any dozen of which would have made the fortune of another popular writer. Stories fell from his hand like cards strewn upon the ground. We have seen how innumerable were the side activities into which he poured the energy he was unable to use in his writing. In his writing alone his energy was superabundant to such a degree that he never really knew what he was doing. His energy was the master, and he was merely the scribe. Unused, half used, misused, was ever anything like that energy? Mr. Paine tells of his piling up hundreds of manuscript pages only because his brain was thronging as with a myriad of fireflies, a swarm of darting, flashing ideas demanding release. He was always throwing himself away upon some trifle, stumbling over himself, as it were, because the end he had actually focused was so absurdly inadequate to the means he couldn't help lavishing upon it. There was a double-barreled detective story, for instance. It suggests an elephant trying to play with a pea. What is the story, after all, but a sort of gigantic burlesque on Sherlock Holmes? That is the obscure intention, unless I am mistaken. Mark Twain wants to show you how simple it is to turn these little tricks of the storyteller's trade. And what is the final result? A total defeat. Sherlock Holmes emerges from the contest as securely the victor as a living gnat perched upon the nose of a dead lion. And then there were those vast quantities of letters, 20, 30, 40 pages long, which he is said to have written to Mr. Howells. "I am writing to you," he remarks in one that has been published, "not because I have anything to say, but because you don't have to answer, and I need something to do this afternoon." Mark Twain's letters are not good letters just because of this lack of economy. His mind does not play over things with that instinctive check and balance that makes good gossip. It merely opens the sluice and lets nature tumble through, in all its meaningless abundance. That was Mark Twain's way. Think of the plans he conceived and never carried out, even the fraction of them that we have record of, the "multitude of discarded manuscripts" Mr. Paine mentions now and then. 3 bulky manuscripts about Satan, a diary of Shem in Noah's Ark, 3,000 Years Among the Microbes, a burlesque manual of etiquette, a story about life in the interior of an iceberg, Hellfire Hotchkiss, Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer Among the Indians, another book about Huck and Tom, half written in 1897, a third book begun after his return to Missouri in 1902, a ghastly tale about an undertaker's love affair which did not pass the family censor. Somehow he could never tell the difference, the story of a dubious miraculous conception in Arkansas, the autobiography of a damn fool, the mysterious chamber, the 1002nd Arabian Night, in which Scheherazade was finally to talk the Sultan to death. How many others were there? It was always hit or miss with Mark Twain, that large, loose, ignorant way he had of talking in later years, so meticulous in his statistics, so exceedingly fallible in his social intuitions. How like so many other elderly Americans of our day who have lived lives of authority. Was it not characteristic of his whole career? That vast flow, that vast fog of promiscuous talk, was it garrulous? Was it not rather phosphorescent, swarming with glinting fragments of an undeveloped genius, like space itself, with all the stars of space following some dim orbit perhaps, but beyond the certain consciousness outside the feeblest control of any mortal mind? An undeveloped genius, an undeveloped artistic faculty, could there be a surer sign of it than this lack of inner control? What we observe in all this prodigal and chaotic display of energy is the natural phenomenon who has not acquired the characteristics of the artist at all, those 2 supreme characteristics especially, upon which Rodin so insisted in his writings, patience and conscience, characteristics which Puritanism has monopolized for the moral life, but which are of the essence of all art. Patience, conscience, economy, self-knowledge, all those humble traits of the wise and sober workingman, which every mature artist is, where shall we look for them in Mark Twain's record? "I don't know that I can write a play that will play," he says in a letter from Vienna in 1898, "but no matter, I'll write half a dozen that won't, anyway." Dear me, I didn't know there was such fun in it. I'll write 20 that won't play." This fumbling, frantic child of 63 has forgotten that years before he had been convinced, and with every reason, that write a play he could not. And hear him again: "I have begun 20 magazine articles and books, and flung every one of them aside in turn." Is this a young apprentice impatiently trying out the different aspects of a talent about which he is still in the dark? No, it is a veteran of letters who has been writing books for 30 years, and who, far from attempting new and difficult experiments in his craft, lacks nothing but the perseverance to carry out some trivial undertaking on an old and well tried pattern. It is true that on this occasion his debts had interfered and taken the spirit out of his work. Nevertheless, those months in Vienna, whose tale he tells, were almost typical of his life. He appears habitually to have had 5 or 6 books going at once, which he found it almost impossible to finish. There were always swarms of beginnings, but his impulse seldom carried him through. This was true even of the writing of those books in which, as one might suppose, he was most happily expressing himself. He groaned over Life on the Mississippi, and only drove himself on in order to fulfill an absurd contract that Mark Twain the writer had made with Mark Twain the publisher. And, strangest of all, as it would seem if we did not know how little his wife approved of the book, there was Huckleberry Finn. This man, who had experienced a consuming interest and delight in the composition of a play which Mr. Paine calls "a dreary, absurd, impossible performance," no doubt because he had been able to write the whole of it, 300 pages, in 42 hours by the clock, only by a sort of chance, it appears, finished his one masterpiece at all. He wrote it fitfully, during a period of 8 years, his interest waxing and waning, but never holding out, till at last he succeeded in pushing it into the home stretch. Indeed, he seems to have been all but incapable of absorption. The most engrossing idea he ever had was probably that of the Connecticut Yankee, a book at least more ambitious than any other he attempted. But even the demoniac possession of that, for it was demoniac, suffered a swift interruption. Hardly was he immersed in it when he rushed out again in a sudden sally. It was in defense of General Grant's English style, and the red rag this time was the grammatical peccability of Matthew Arnold. In all this capricious, distracted, uncertain, spasmodic effort we observe the desperate amateur, driven back again and again by a sudden desire, by necessity, by 100 impulsions to a task which he cannot master, which fascinates him and yet, to speak paradoxically, fails to interest him. Nothing is more significant than this total lack of sustained interest in his work, his lack of interest in literature itself, for that matter. In all his books, in all the endless pages of his life and letters, there is scarcely a hint of any concern with the technique, or, indeed, with any other aspect of what was nothing else, surely, than his art. I have just noted the general character of his aesthetic taste. He was well satisfied with it. He was undisturbed by aesthetic curiosity. He said he detested novels. In general, he seems to have read none but those of Mr. Howells, his father confessor in literature. He told more than once how, at a London dinner table, Mrs. Clemens had been tortured to have to admit to Stepniak that he had never read Balzac, Thackeray, and the others. He said that his brother had tried to get him to read Dickens, and that, although he was ashamed, he could not do it. He had read only, and that several times, A Tale of Two Cities, because, we may assume, its theme is the French Revolution, in which he had an abiding interest. An animal repugnance to Jane Austen, an irritated schoolboy's dislike of Scott and Cooper, is not that the measure of the literary criticism he has left us? But here again there was a positive note his lifelong preoccupation with grammar. How many essays and speeches, introductions, and extravaganzas by Mark Twain turn upon some question whose interest is purely or mainly verbal? English as she is taught, a simplified alphabet, the awful German language, a majestic literary fossil, Fenimore Cooper's literary offenses, Italian with grammar, William Dean Howells, General Grant and Matthew Arnold, the new guide of the conversation in Portuguese and English. It is the letter perfection of Mr. Howells that dazzles him. The want of it he considers a sufficient reason for saying, "You're another," to Matthew Arnold, and tripping him up over some imaginary verbal gaucherie. He is indignant with Cooper for calling women "females." Indignation was Mark Twain's habitual attitude toward the modes of the past, and foreign languages never ceased to be infinitely ludicrous to him just because they weren't English. These are all signs of the young schoolboy who has begun to take a pride in his first compositions, and who has become suddenly aware of words. And I suggest that Mark Twain never reached the point of being more at home in the language of civilization than that. His preoccupation with letter perfection is thrown into a significant light by the style of Huckleberry Finn. If the beauty and the greatness of that book spring from the joyous freedom of the author, is it not because in throwing off the bonds of the bourgeois society whose mold he had been obliged to take, he was reverting not only to a frame of mind he had essentially never outgrown, but to a native idiom as well? Mark Twain has told us again and again that in all vital matters a man is the product of his training. If we wanted further proof that his taste was simply rudimentary, we might observe that it developed in some slight measure, though very slightly and inconclusively, the training having come too late. Mr. Paine tells us, for example, that 12 years after the pilgrimage of The Innocents Abroad, he found the new bright copies of the old masters no longer an improvement on the originals, although he still did not care for the originals. Indeed, if we wish to understand the reason for the barbarous contempt he displays, obtrusively in his earlier work, for the historic memorials of the human spirit in Europe, we have only to turn to the postscript of The Innocents Abroad itself. "We were at home in Palestine," says Mark Twain. "It was easy to see that that was the grand feature of the expedition. We had cared nothing much about Europe. We galloped through the Louvre, the Pitti, the Uffizi, the Vatican, all the galleries. We examined modern and ancient statuary with a critical eye in Florence, Rome, or anywhere we found it, and praised it if we saw fit, and if we didn't, we said we preferred the wooden Indians in front of the cigar stores of America. But the Holy Land brought out all our enthusiasm. We fell into raptures by the barren shores of Galilee. We pondered at Tabor and at Nazareth. Yes, the pilgrimage part of the excursion was its pet feature. There is no question about that." Why? Why were Paris and Rome nothing to Mark Twain but the material for an indifferent, a hostile persiflage, while Jerusalem was "full of poetry, sublimity, and, more than all, dignity"? It was because the only education he had known was that Hebraic education which led Matthew Arnold to say that the American people of his time were simply the English middle class transplanted. To "fear God and dread the Sunday school," he wrote to Mr. Howells once, "exactly described that old feeling which I used to have." But had he ever outgrown this fear and dread? Had not his wife and all those other narrow puritanical influences to which he had subjected himself simply taken the place of the Sunday school in his mind? Tom Sawyer Abroad, which he wrote quite late in life, is an old fashioned Western country Sunday school scholar's romantic dream of the land of Egypt. Tom Sawyer's Abroad doesn't include Europe at all, and we have seen that Mark Twain's general attitude as a European tourist remained always that of the uninitiated American business man. His attention had been fixed in his childhood upon the civilization of the biblical lands, and that is why they seem to him so full of poetry and dignity. His attention had never been fixed upon the civilization of Europe, and that is why it seemed to him so empty and absurd. Faced with these cultural phenomena, he reverted all his life to the attitude which had been established in him in his boyhood and had been confirmed by all the forces that had arrested his development beyond that stage. How then are we to describe Mark Twain's literary character? Mr. Paine speaks of his genius as given rather to elaboration than to construction. He says that most of his characters reflected intimate personalities of his early life. He refers to two of his chief gifts, transcription and portrayal, adding that he was always greater at these things than at invention. Are not these traits, which are indisputable, the traits of a mind that has never attained to creation in the proper sense, a mind that has stopped short of the actual process of art? As we run over the list of his books, we see that the majority of them, including virtually all his good work, were not even creative in design, but rather reminiscent, descriptive, autobiographical, or historical. The Innocents Abroad, Roughing It, A Tramp Abroad, Following the Equator, Joan of Arc, Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, Life on the Mississippi. It was as a pilot on the river, he said, that he had learned to know human nature and the world. But had he assimilated what he learned? When in later days he turned back upon his life for literary material, it was not this great period that rose in his mind, save for the merely descriptive work of Life on the Mississippi. And even there it is the river itself and not its human nature that comes most insistently before us. It was his boyhood in Hannibal. Mark Twain remembered, indeed, the marvelous gallery of American types the Mississippi had spread before him, but it had never become his for art. His imagination had never attained the mastery over that variegated world of men. That his spirit had, in fact, been closed to experience is indicated in Mr. Paine's statement that most of his characters reflected intimate personalities of his early life. He has sketched a few portraits in outline, a few caricatures, but the only characters he is able to conceive realistically are boys. In The Gilded Age alone, in the sole character of Laura Hawkins, one can fairly say he handles the material of real life with the novelist's intention. And what a character, what a love story hers is! It is a long story. Unfortunately, it is an old story, and it need not be dwelt upon, he says of Laura's seduction, with a prudent eye for the refined sensibilities of those ladies of Hartford under whose surveillance the book was written. It was a fortunate thing that Mark Twain did not attempt to dwell upon it. He would have had his task showing in detail how the fair and virginal Laura became the consummate artist in passion. He says she did. He turns Laura into a Jezebel because, it is perfectly plain, the moral prepossessions of Hartford having been transgressed in her person, it was the popular melodramatic thing to do. He was both afraid and unable to present her character truly, and in consequence too impatient, too indifferent, too little interested, even to attempt it. We have here the conclusive, the typical illustration of his failure as a creative artist. His original submission to the taboos of his environment had prevented him from assimilating life. Consequently, he was prevented, as much by his own immaturity as by fear of public opinion, from ever attempting seriously to recreate it in his imagination. We can best describe Mark Twain, therefore, as an improvisator, a spirit with none of the inner control, none of the self determination of the artist, who composed extempore, as it were, and at the solicitation of influences external to himself. It is remarkable how many of his ideas are developments of news items floating about in his journalist's imagination, items like the Siamese twins and the Tichborne case. Except for the ever recurring themes of Huck and Tom, one would say that his own spirit never prompted his imagination at all. Certainly his own spirit never controlled it. His books are without form and without development. They tell themselves; their author never holds the reins, a fact he naively confesses in the preface of Those Extraordinary Twins. Before the book was half finished those three were taking things almost entirely into their own hands, and working the whole tale as a private venture of their own. Moreover, he depended upon outside stimulus, not to quicken his mental machinery merely, but actually to set it going. When in later life he wrote that man is moved, directed, commanded by exterior influences solely, he was simply describing his personal experience. Glance at his record once more. What led him to undertake the voyage that resulted in The Innocents Abroad? Chiefly the advice of Anson Burlingame. After publishing The Innocents Abroad, we are told, he had begun early in the year to talk about another book, but nothing had come of it beyond a project or two, more or less hazy and unpursued. It was only when his publisher came forward and suggested that he should write a book about his travels and experiences in the far West that he set to work at the composition of Roughing It. The presence and stimulus of his friend Twichell enabled him to write A Tramp Abroad. We know this from the fact that he undertook a subsequent journey down the Rhone with the express purpose of writing another book which, because, as he repeatedly said, Twichell was not with him, resulted in nothing but a state of coma and 1,000 chaotic notes he never used. In 1874 we find him again waiting for the impulse that seems hardly ever to have come from within. His wife and Howells urge him to write for the Atlantic, and it is only then that fresh memories rise in his mind and he begins life on the Mississippi. In 1878 the demand for a new Mark Twain book of travel was an added reason for going to Europe again. The chief motive that roused him to the composition of A Connecticut Yankee seems to have been to provide an adequate mouthful for the yawning jaws of his own publishing business. And even Huckleberry Finn, if we are to believe Mr. Paine, was not spontaneously born. He had received from somewhere new afflatus for the story of Huck and Tom, and was working on it steadily. This absence in him of the proud, instinctive autonomy of the artist is illustrated in another trait also. How overjoyed he was when he could get Mr. Howells to read his proofs for him, the proofs even of the books he had written for love, and how willing he was to have those proofs mauled and slashed. "His proof sheets came back to the Atlantic," says Mr. Howells, "each a veritable mush of concessions, as Emerson says," and before he had finished Life on the Mississippi he set his publisher to work editing it, with the consequence, he writes, that "large areas of it are condemned here and there and yonder." Here I think we approach the secret of Mark Twain's notorious laziness. Mr. Paine assures us that he was not lazy in the ordinary sense of the word. That he detested manual labor is true enough, but at the work for which he was fitted and intended it may be set down here on authority, and despite his own frequent assertions to the contrary, that To his last year he was the most industrious of men. Very well, but what are we to say of that languor of his, that love of the loose luxury of undress and the comfort of pillows, which grew upon him especially in later years, when he received his company propped up in bed in that gorgeous Persian dressing gown, that state of coma and lazy comfort and solid happiness into which he was always drifting, that indolence which, aside from his incessant billiard playing, led him to spend most of a summer in mid life playing tenpins. Much of it, no doubt, was a pose. It was a way of protesting to the public and his matter of fact friends that if he was engaged in a pursuit as altogether useless as that of literature, at least he wasn't taking it too seriously. That accounts for what Mr. Paine calls his frequent assertions to the contrary, but part of this lax mood was involuntary, and is not to be attributed to his Southern temperament. It was the sign that he was essentially unemployed. It was the flapping, as it were, of those great sails the wind had never filled. There he was, a man, with all the powers and energies of a man, living the irresponsible life of a boy. There he was, an artist, a potential artist, living the life of a journalist. Everything he did was 100 times too easy for him. The goal he had set himself, the goal that had been set for him, was so low that it not only failed to enlist his real forces, but actually obliged him to live slackly. He was thus a sort of individual analogy to the capitalist regime which, as Mr. Veblen describes it, is capable of reaping its profits only by maintaining throughout the industrial system in general a certain incapacity by advisement. And in order to spare himself in his own eyes, he convinced himself that this laziness was predestined. Mr. Paine's biography opens with these words: On page 492 of the old volume of Suetonius, which Mark Twain read until his very last day, there is a reference to one Flavius Clemens, a man of wide repute for his want of energy, and in a marginal note he has written, "I guess this is where our line starts." If people are lazy, one imagines him saying to himself, it may sometimes be their own fault. But who can blame the man who is born lazy, the man who is descended from a lazy line? It is only as a result of the stoppage of his creative life that we can explain also the endless distractions to which his literary career was subject. "I came here," he writes from London as early as 1872, "to take notes for a book, but I haven't done much but attend dinners and make speeches." That innocent réclame of his, that irresistible passion for the limelight which was forever drawing off the forces that ought to have been invested in his work, was due largely, no doubt, to his inordinate desire for approval, for self-corroboration. But if his heart had been in his work, would he have courted so many interruptions? For court them he did. He invited, he brought upon himself a mode of living that made work almost impossible. "I don't really get anything done worth speaking of," he writes in 1881, "except during the 3 or 4 months that we are away in the summer. I keep 3 or 4 books on the stocks all the time, but I seldom add a satisfactory chapter to one of them." Was Mrs. Clemens to blame? We are distinctly told that she was dazed, that she was appalled at the extravagant manner of living into which the household had drifted. Mark Twain's vast energy had flowed into this channel of the opulent householder because it had not been able to find free expression in his work, and the happier he was in that role the more irksome his work became. "Maybe you think I am not happy," he writes. The very thing that gravels me is that I am. I don't want to be happy when I can't work. I am resolved that hereafter I won't be." And at that brilliant apogee of his life, when his daughter noted that he had just become interested in mind cure, he took up his writing quarters in the billiard room, where, perfect witness that he was to the truth of Herbert Spencer's old saw about billiard playing and a misspent youth, he was ready at all hours to receive his friends and impress them into the game, where, indeed, he could almost count on the pleasure of being interrupted. He whose literary work had become a mere appanage of his domestic life, whose writing went by fits and starts, and who certainly took no pains to keep himself in form for it, had such a passion for billiards that he would play all night and "stay till the last man gave out from sheer exhaustion." For all his exuberance, in short, he was not, on the whole, happy in his work. Almost from the beginning of his career we note in him an increasing distaste for this literary journalism which he would hardly have experienced if he had not been intended for quite another life. We remember that cry of distress when he was setting out on the Quaker City excursion, that cry which must have seemed so fantastically meaningless to those who read his letter: "I am so worthless that it seems to me I never do anything or accomplish anything that lingers in my mind as a pleasant memory. An accusing conscience gives me peace only in excitement and restless moving from place to place." What was it but the conscience of the artist in him, lulled into a fitful sleep by the applause of all America, before it had ever been able quite to penetrate into the upper layers of his mind? Mr. Paine has noted the change in tone between the first and second parts of Life on the Mississippi, written with an interval of 12 years, the change from art to industry, the difference "between the labors of love and duty." He avers that the second half might have been as glamorous as the first if Mark Twain had revisited the river 8 or 10 years earlier, before he had become a theoretical pessimist, and before the river itself had become a background for pessimism. Mr. Paine would have his task explaining in that connection the difference between theoretical pessimism and pessimism of the other sort. For it was just so between The Innocents Abroad and A Tramp Abroad. It was even more so between A Tramp Abroad and Following the Equator. "In The Tramp," says Mr. Paine, "he has still the sense of humor, but he has become a cynic, restrained, but a cynic none the less." All that descriptive writing in which alone, perhaps, he could count upon an absolutely certain financial success, how repellent it became to him as time went on. Watch him guilefully trying to wriggle out of the self imposed task of A Tramp Abroad. He tells his friend Twichell that he has lost his Swiss notebook, and, who knows, perhaps he won't have to write the book after all. Then the notebook comes to light, and he is plunged in gloom. "I was about to write to my publisher and propose some other book, when the confounded thing turned up, and down went my heart into my boots." It seemed to him, says Mr. Paine, that he had been given a life sentence. And to what does he turn for relief? The Prince and the Pauper, which he lingers over and cannot bear to finish, telling Mr. Howells that after that veritable nightmare of A Tramp Abroad nothing can diminish his jubilant delight in writing it. He is a child among children again, doing a task that almost any gifted child might have done, something that is for him the equivalent of a charade, a pretty game with his little daughters, and basking, for the moment, in the approval of his wife. We have seen, and it seems to me the most conclusive proof of his arrested development, that Mark Twain showed not only no respect for literature, but no vital personal pride in his own pursuit of it. What is the true artist's natural attitude toward his work? Henry James, in his finical, exaggerated fashion, expressed it I think overexpressed it in his passionate anxiety not to do so in something he wrote once of his early tales. I, of course, really and truly cared for them, as we say, more than for aught else whatever, cared for them with that kind of care, infatuated though it may seem, that makes it bliss for the fond votary never to so much as speak of the loved object, makes it a refinement of piety to perform his rites under cover of a perfect freedom of mind as to everything but them. Compare this with what Mark Twain wrote when he was setting to work at The American Claimant. My right arm is nearly disabled with rheumatism, but I am bound to write this book and sell 100,000 copies of it no, I mean 1,000,000 next fall. I feel sure I can dictate the book into a phonograph if I don't have to yell. That is only an extreme instance of what appears to have been his habitual attitude toward his work, an attitude of almost cynical indifference, of insolence even. Once, however, he approached it in a quite different spirit, with a significant and exceptional result that proves the rule. Though the creative enthusiasm in his other books soon passed, says Mr. Paine, his glory in the tale of Joan never died. In a note which he made on his 73rd birthday, indeed, when all his important works lay far behind him, he said, I like the Joan of Arc best of all my books, and it is the best. I know it perfectly well. Did he really consider it his best book? We shall see presently that in this, as in other matters, his judgment was quite unstable, quite unreliable, quite immature, and certainly, beside Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, no one else can take very seriously a work that is, for all its charm, scarcely anything but a literary chromo. Why, then, did Mark Twain look back upon it with such a unique satisfaction? It was because he had had no ulterior object in view in writing it, because for once in this book he had approached his work in the spirit, at least, of the artist and the craftsman. Possibly, we find him writing to a friend, and how exceptional the phrase is on Mark Twain's pen, possibly the book may not sell, but that is nothing. It was written for love. But more striking still is the testimony of a later note. It furnished me 7 times the pleasure afforded me by any of the others. 12 years of preparation and 2 years of writing. The others needed no preparation and got none. In other words, in this book alone he had consciously exercised the instinct of workmanship, the instinct he had exercised in that career as a pilot to which he always looked back so regretfully. What if Huckleberry Finn was incomparably greater? What if he had for Tom Sawyer a peculiar and intimately proprietary affection? There he had been simply the divine amateur, improvising the tale of his own fond memories, and however much he loved them, he took no particular pride in the writing of them. He never thought of publishing them anonymously, as he published Joan at first, lest it should suffer from the obloquy of a pen name that had been compromised by so many dubious ventures. He readily acquiesced, in fact, in his wife's attitude of indifference toward the always ungrammatical and often improper Odyssey of his own childhood. With Joan of Arc it was different. Those 12 years of preparation, those 2 years of writing, were the secret of his delight in it, his respect for it. A poor thing, but indubitably mine, the spirit of the artist in him seems to be saying, That spirit which came into its own so late and burned so feebly then, and was so quickly gutted out. Did he not call it "a book which writes itself, a tale which tells itself. I merely have to hold the pen"? It was, indeed, only in the dimmest sense a creation. It was nothing but a réchauffé for children, for sentimental grown up children. Something of his own personality, no doubt, went into it, the animus of a scarcely conscious, an obscurely treasured, ideal of the heroic life. But his pride and his joy in the book sprang, one feels, from a more specific achievement. He had never known so fully before what absorption means, what it means to take pains in all the complicated sense of honest workmanship. If this explanation is the correct one, it is easy indeed to determine the measure of Mark Twain's maturity, to prove that he was at the same time a born artist and one who never developed beyond the primitive stage. Only once, and with a significant result in his own confession, have we found him working at literature as the artist works. But think of the care he lavished upon lecturing and oral story-telling. He was, says Mr. Howells, "the most consummate public performer I ever saw. On the platform he was the great and finished actor which he probably would not have been on the stage." And to what was this eminence due? His carefully studied effects. This man, who was capable of all but yelling his books into a phonograph, approached the platform with all the circumspection of a conscious master. There we find him prudent, prescient, self-respectful, deliberately taking pains, as he shows in one of his letters, to rest and equip himself beforehand. "Unless I get a great deal of rest," he says, and he makes no jokes now about his laziness, "a ghastly dullness settles down upon me on the platform and turns my performance into work, and hard work, whereas it ought always to be pastime, recreation, solid enjoyment." There is the voice of the artist, the prompting of the true craftsman's conscience. I have said that he was indifferent to technique, abnormally incurious, in fact, of all the means of the literary art. But who that has read his essay, "How to Tell a Story," will forget the proud skill of the raconteur of the Golden Arm? Those who imagine that an artist is just an inspired child of nature might well consider the attitude of mind revealed in this little essay. Mark Twain first heard the story of the Golden Arm from an old negro to whose cabin he used to resort as a boy in Hannibal, and just as we have seen him reverent in the Holy Land because of the initiation of the Sunday school, so now we see him reverent in art because of the initiation of that first master who had remained, indeed, save for Horace Bixby, the pilot, his only master. To tell that story rightly, to pause just long enough in just the proper places, to enunciate each word with just the accurate emphasis, and at last, oh, so warily, oh, so carefully, so consciously, with such control, to spring that final effect of horror, there was something worthy of a man's passionate endeavor. Did not Mark Twain assert again and again in his old age that no one can rise above the highest limit attainable through the outside helps afforded by the ideals, influences, and training of the society into which he is born? Who in the Gilded Age of America cared for literature, cared for it enough to celebrate it, to glorify it, to live it? What master in the highest of the arts had Mark Twain ever found comparable in relative authority, in essential authority, with that old negro raconteur, that old pilot of the Mississippi? What real criticism, what exacting appreciation had Mark Twain, the writer, ever received? Had not his wife, indifferent to his best work, encouraged him to write puerilities? Had not Howells even, the critical court of last resort in this country, praised him as often for his ineptitudes as for his lucky flights of genius? Who had expected anything of him, in short, or put him on his mettle? But at least America understood the primitive art of oral story-telling. At least America had understood the primitive art of the Mississippi pilot. In those two spheres, and in those alone, Mark Twain had found inspiring masters. He had encountered a penetrating criticism, an apt, subtle, and thrilling appreciation. In those two spheres he had been invited to pass muster, and he had done so. What if he had never read Balzac and the others? That old negro of his childhood, with all his ancient inherited folk skill, he was Mark Twain's Balzac, and no young novelist ever more fervently humbled himself before the high priest of his métier, ever more passionately drank in the wisdom of the source, ever more proudly rose, by ardent endeavor, to the point where, before going his own way, he could almost do what the high priest himself had done. Mark Twain had never individually "come into his intellectual conscience," in Mr. Howells's phrase, at all. His creative spirit had remained rudimentary and almost undifferentiated. But that his natural genius was very great is proved once more by the extraordinary zest with which he threw himself into those approximately artistic channels he found open before him. It was one of Mark Twain's favorite fancies, Mr. Paine says, that life should begin with old age and progress backwards. We can understand it now. We can understand why his mind was essentially retrospective, and why so much of his writing deals with his childhood. The autobiographical impulse is normal in old age. When men cannot build on hope, they build on memory. Their minds regress into the past, because they no longer have a future. It is generally understood, therefore, that when people in middle age occupy themselves with their childhood, it is because some central instinct in them has been blocked by either internal or external obstacles. Their consciousness flows backward until it reaches a period in their memory when life still seemed to them open and fluid with possibilities. Who does not see in the extraordinary number of books about boys and boyhood written by American authors the surest sign of the prevalence of that arrested moral development which is the result of the business life, the universal repression in the American population of all those impulses that conflict with commercial success? So it was with Mark Twain. In him the autobiographical impulse, characteristic of old age, awoke very early. As far back as 1880 we find him attempting from time to time, according to Mr. Paine, an absolutely faithful autobiography, and he resumed the attempt in 1885, at the time when he was assisting Grant with his memoirs. It remained his dominant literary impulse. "Earn a character if you can, and if you can't," says Pudd'nhead Wilson, "then assume one." Mark Twain had assumed the character of his middle years. He had only truly lived, he had only been himself, as a child, and the experience of childhood was the only experience he had assimilated. That is why he was perpetually recurring to his early life in Hannibal, why the books he wrote con amore were books about childhood, and why he instinctively wrote not only about but also for children. By doing so he knew, or something in him knew, what many another American author has known since, that he was capturing the whole public. 10,000,000 business men that was the public, the masculine public, of Mark Twain's time. And are not business men in general, in a sense not quite intended by the coiner of the phrase, children of a larger growth? Mark Twain, I say, instinctively wrote for children. It is true that he seems often to have believed that Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer could only be understood and appreciated by mature readers. Certainly Joan of Arc was put forth as a historical romance for mature readers. But what do we find him saying while he is still at work on Tom Sawyer? I finally concluded to cut the Sunday school speech down to the first two sentences, leaving no suggestion of satire, since the book is to be for boys and girls. And as for Joan of Arc, with what did he associate it in his own mind? I am writing, he says in a letter to a publishing friend, a companion piece to The Prince and the Pauper, and this, added to the fact that he wrote it in constant sympathetic consultation with his own children, is the best extrinsic proof of its real character. Written for children, then, more than half consciously, all these books were, and I will not accept even The Mysterious Stranger, permeated as it is with a mood that is purely adolescent, though an old man wrote it and few children, probably, have ever read it. Written for and written of children all these books were, for it is clear that the protagonists of The Mysterious Stranger are the boys through whose eyes the story unfolds itself, and who taste its bitterness, and Joan of Arc, seen through the eyes of the Sieur de Conte, is a child also. And these, I say, were the books he wrote with love, with a happiness that sometimes seemed sacred to him. It was this happiness that haloed the tale of Joan, although Professor Phelps says that in 1904 he spoke of Huckleberry Finn as undoubtedly his best book, and that he had for Tom Sawyer a very special feeling is shown in a letter, one of those famous unmailed letters, written in 1887 to a theatrical manager who had dramatized the story and proposed to put it on the stage. That is a book, dear sir, which cannot be dramatized. One might as well try to dramatize any other hymn. Tom Sawyer is simply a hymn, put into prose form to give it a worldly air. There were plays which he wrote with an exuberant gaiety, but that was the lusty fun of the man of action, the boy who enjoyed throwing sticks into a swift stream. It was not the happiness of the soul in process of delivering itself. That happiness, I say, sanctified these children's books alone, these books that suggest the green, luxuriant shoots clustering on the stump of some gigantic tree which has been felled close to the ground. End of Chapter 7. The Playboy in Letters, read by John Greenman.